Hello, very beautiful community. Community. Very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. Tremendously beautiful community. Hello. You can see here, see here, see here. Let's do scrollification upwards in our absurd world. Bit of red bush tea with oat milk to get ourselves going. Let's rock and roll. Uncle Fred, Vlad, talk about Trump's deployment of the National Guard. As a Canadian, it's surreal reading these headlines. So I'll try to be a bit more brief today with the questions that remain, that were left before we started, just to catch us into more of a live conversation quickly. Worry about it, but worry more about future, less lovely usages, and worry about precedents set today. Crypticious, Vlad, what would we consider when balancing politeness, interpret that as it will, against effectiveness when assessing a political action? The key conflict in political action, especially if it's protest, is not politeness versus effectiveness. It's effectiveness versus expressiveness. I'll come to the conflict you mentioned in a moment, but the key thing is what I'm doing going to bring it about that positive change happens in the direction in which I wish for it to happen? Or am I just standing for something that's enormously ethically important to me, whether it makes any difference or not? That's an absolutely key distinction. And we often act expressively, but pretend we act effectively. When it comes to politeness versus effectiveness, the key consideration here is, what people do you want to address when you're doing what you're doing? And are you alienating them or inviting them in? If you want to address a majority, the last thing you want to do is present something in a way that'll piss off the ordinary person on the doorstep. So you've got to understand there are many different conversations happening in the culture, and your conversation has to have the self-awareness about who it involves, right? That's really important. If you want to sort of put an example on the table, I would say that a lot of climate protest that people feel uncomfortable about, I would defend. But when it comes to doing damage to works of art, as Just Stop Oil, for example, have done in the UK, I am skeptical that it's counterproductive. And it's counterproductive because the disposition to love a work of art is not entirely distinct from the disposition to have an adequate relationship with nature. That was longer than I wanted. Rusky Go Home, congratulations on your somewhat fascistized handle. Hello, Vlad. Could you please explain why John Rawls is your intellectual enemy? Well, that's, of course, tongue-in-cheek. John Rawls is one of the greatest moral, rather political philosophers of the 20th century. And the way I understand Rawls's two great books, A Theory of Justice from the early 70s and Political Liberalism from over 20 years later, is that they are almost absurdly intensified and systematized pictures of how America might think about itself politically. So when you get a work that wonderful, it's better always than the issue whether its arguments are right. So what at a minimum Rawls does is that he mirrors back to us some of our ways of thinking about ourselves. And if Rawls is wrong, he's interestingly wrong because he's conveying back to us who we are. The reason I come from a very different tradition is that I don't believe it is possible to engage in the kind of abstraction from a conception of the good life, from a sense of the kind of ethical and political life that gives one purpose that Rawls suggests is possible. So for me, it is extremely psychologically tyrannical and completely naive politically to ask for the kind of abstraction that Rawls is asking for. What he's effectively asking for is that we emaciate ourselves as agents. But that kind of emaciation is in fact going to lead to a situation where we don't have enough friction to act to think of ourselves as acting in a meaningful way. Much more about this on the Philosophy channel, and I do think there is a video either on the Philosophy channel or on this channel about Rawls. Unless I took it down. If I did, then I'll make a Jack Rawls video on the Philosophy channel. He's a man toward whom I have a very, very, very loving disposition. Toby, given Putin sees himself as so intimately tied to Russia's destiny, what are your thoughts on a near-death Putin pushing the button? It would be foolish to rule out a situation in which the Putin regime was on the ropes, has a choice around taking certain extreme measures, and then definitely chooses to avoid them. I'd be skeptical about that scenario. These are people who, when their lives are on the line, and regime security and lives on the line is the same thing for these guys, um, are going to be much more apocalyptically receptive than we would be in the West, actually. Let me just turn down my oxygen a bit. So, yes, that's actually a worry. But we're nowhere near that situation, especially now when Putin thinks he's winning the war. Hey, Vlad, David says, what's your take on conscription in Ukraine? As an American, I'd like to be supportive, but I don't want the US holding their people hostage in a proxy war. Russia and Ukraine both have conscription crises. Ukraine's is worse. It's a very difficult situation. One of the biggest difficulties is that in a completely messy world, without a clear sense of what you can depend on for your allies, Ukraine can't build a clear picture of what it's fighting for to its own population. And that's extremely demoralizing. So the wash of global geopolitical uncertainty is profoundly demobilizing because it means Ukraine can't really have a clear strategy. And one of the problems over the last few years for Ukraine has been that their primary strategy for victory has been political collapse in Russia. Well, that's not a strategy, just serendipity. That could happen, that might not happen, but it's not something that Ukraine could bring about meaningfully unless it got much, much more support than it could have ever got from the West. So it's an extremely difficult situation. And one of the problems they've got is that they can't paint a very clear strategic picture of beyond fighting for independence, what they're fighting toward, what they're fighting to achieve. Echelon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on systemic failure beyond just democratic gridlock. We're increasingly seeing systems not working properly. Here in the Netherlands, the tax code can't be adjusted, even after a majority vote and so on. So I do think there's a book that's come out addressing this recently in an American context called Abundance, which I think doesn't go enough, but it's not its job to go far in challenging various kinds of neoliberal challenges we've run into. But it certainly addresses state efficacy very seriously as an issue. State incapacity is 10x more damaging to trust today than it would have been 10, 20 years ago, because it's making people feel like politics is just not working for them. people put a very holistic interpretation on something particular, not being achievable, not being movable by practical politics. 20 years ago, they would have said, well, we can't adjust the tax code properly. Oh, damn it. Today, people are going to say, the system doesn't work. And some are going to go on from that and say, well, we should throw it in the bin. Michael says, I received a reply comment, that Michael received a reply comment from Jordan Peterson, a complex guy. I don't always understand his comments. Are you a fan? Well, I generally don't do being fans, but I think there's probably enough content on the channels about Jordan Peterson. The chief problem with Jordan at the moment, short of the fact that he is algorithmically compromised, is that he presents critiques of our cultures as though they were explanatory, whereas they're just complaints. So it's his critique of our circumstances is much more superficial than he makes it out to be. But I'll talk about that in greater depth. Ismail, talk about the death of Europe's supposed moral authority because of Gaza. And you talk about the G word as well. Well, I'm planning a sort of 60, 90-minute grounding chat about this because having talked about this 5, 6, 7, 8 times in autumn 2023, we haven't come back to it in detail. And certainly what my community needs from me is a kind of moral compass here, which is illuminating. It's not one you have to share, but it's illuminating. And it's my responsibility to give it. And so I very much look forward to refreshing us on that. Now, I said nearly everything that's important and needed to be said in autumn 2023 because things were already clear then. I do think that the degree to which we have failed to come to terms at the level of our political systems with what Israel did in Gaza is enormously conducive to distrust in our own societies and enormously conducive to kind of a corrosive lack of faith among our own citizens in what our leaders tell us about other conflicts in the world. So, to make an obvious connection, what the British Prime Minister says about Ukraine is severely undermined by what he says or doesn't say enough about Gaza. There is, of course, a separate and very important conversation here about the G word. And that, in a way, is always one and a half conversations. There's a kind of conversation about what, if you like, the G word means according to its instantiation in the international norms. But it doesn't follow from that these norms have instantiated it in a good way, right? You might encounter the Declaration for Human Rights, which talks about holidays and talks about conditions of employment, which I think that have nothing to do with human rights and a reasonable conception. They've got to do with rights, all right, but not human rights. So you can't take the Genocide Convention as simply giving you the substance of the concept. It's just an elaboration of the concept. It's a construction of the concept. And citing it is only limitedly relevant. Because if you cite it and it happens to be a good elaboration of the concept, fine and well. But if you cite it and it happens to be a very bad elaboration of the concept, you haven't got very far, except perhaps to have illustrated where things stand in relation to international norms. But then 80% of the G question is actually about cultural reception. It's not about, right? It's not about jurisprudential norms. What I can tell you is that I'm a G word skeptic, as all my heroes historically would be. very few moral or political philosophers of real stature from recent decades would use the G word anywhere as near as liberally as we do, whether one talks about Ukraine or the Uyghurs or Gaza. But quite frankly, that's irrelevant because other terms that bring it about that we understand the appalling nature of what's going on, other terms do enough. Um, from ethnic cleansing to absolutely egregious and insupportable mass slaughter devoid of strategy. So I'm really looking forward to a grounding chat about this. What makes this even worse is that we haven't properly managed to um, uh, ethically grasp and ethically condemn October 7th either in the West. So we're an absolute ethical mess, quite frankly, around things that should be less complex than we're making them out to be. But let me be absolutely clear. The situation in Gaza is far beyond the conversation of whether Israel is acting proportionally or disproportionately. To say that Israel is acting disproportionately is a dramatic underestimation of the evil caused in Gaza. Hi, Vlad, anti war Russian viewer here. In our community, there are more people who seem to be more sympathetic toward Trump's effort to end the war compared to Biden and Europeans. Um, we seem to be giving him more credit for trying, while it seems the Europeans just want the war to go on and buy themselves time. That's roughly fair. I mean, the Europeans are not saying, Donald, you know, we also want the war to end and meaning it. They're roughly not seeing a way for the war to end now, and they want for the war to continue with minimal um, compromise on support for Ukraine. Um, so you claiming the Europeans want the war to go on and buy themselves time to arm themselves while Ukraine continues to lose territory and people. There is still, although it's diminishing, too much Trump fancy in the Eastern Bloc, whether it's Ukraine or Russia for that matter. And that's because Trump is a Republican. So there's a kind of a very basic anti-democratic prejudice. The Russian intelligentsia is overwhelmingly center-right. That doesn't come out because they're fundamentally opposed to this hard right tyranny. But the Russian intelligentsia is sort of almost in a quaint political way stuck with the sort of seraphic simplicities and calamitousness of 1980s Thatcherite, Reaganite neoliberalism. So they're a very, very politically naive group. And that's partly why their efficacy is so low. The objections to the Russian opposition as such are ludicrous, right? They need to be there, they need to do a good job. The problem is just whether they're doing that or not. So it's always not a question of supporting or not supporting them, it's a question of saying that they need to be doing a good job. So I think that's absolutely huge. And it's sometimes difficult to break through. There's a kind of an anti-democrat, pro-republican position in a lot of the Eastern Bloc. That's a consequence of the Soviet legacy. So that's one element that's playing a role. Another element is wishful thinking and the idea that you could sort of persuade Trump of things. But as I articulate in the main channel video on Trump's narcissism and here on chat too, Trump is blowing about in the wind while having a core personal connection to Putin. That's it. He's not going to do intellectual improvement on his Ukraine position. That's very naive. So you have to understand that Trump is not so distant ideological relative of Putin, that it's institutional checks and balances that are keeping Trump roughly on the democratic straight and narrow for now. And you've got to wake up to this. So there's a combination of various kinds of naivety, the idea that you can sort of make the case and persuade Trump, and the idea that you're talking about people who have come out of the Soviet bloc and have absolutely fixed pro-Republican prejudices. That's changed That's changed, but it's still the case to a great extent that the tendency is to want Trump to be better, to want Trump to be something he isn't. Dr. Tough Guy, what the hell happened to conservatism in the 21st century? There's a anti-institutional revolution, and conservatism has been a great victim of it because so many conservatives have ceased to be conservatives and are now authoritarian populists in conservative clothes. It's very dangerous because a lot of citizens fall for it and think they are still conservatives. Well, they're not. um, they have ceased to be institutional, and you can't be a real conservative and be um, an anti-institutional revolutionary. Now, why has it been quite as bad as it's proven? It's partly because the personal ethics of a lot of important figures on the right have proved to be so lamentable. And they got so rapidly absorbed into not just entrepreneurial, but genuinely institutionally destructive post truth politics. Um, you do it for career success, it happens incrementally, little by little by little. And what you do is that you take uh, a small course alteration that feels all right on the day, but you extrapolate it across a few years and you're genuinely in a very different place. And that's why you have so many constitutional conservatives from 10 years ago really being anti conservative, anti institutional revolutionaries now 10 years on. Okay, that's pretty much most of what was left behind. Let's keep rocking and rolling. Hello, lovely Carter. Shadow Guy Vlad, do you wonder what kind of person you'd be if you'd stayed in the USSR or Russia? Um, I think for me, the question would be whether I would remain on the music track that I was on or whether I would become a philosopher. And my temptation is to say that I would become a philosopher. Um, you're also asking how I would deal with my health condition there. Um, look, my health condition is as real as a fire everywhere. There's lots of people suffering with it in Ukraine right now, lots of people suffering with it everywhere. In fact, we just had a situation of a young man in Ukraine being very badly mistreated by the medical system there and wrongly institutionalized in a psych ward when he had nothing mentally wrong with him. He had ME, and very bad in Eastern Europe, very bad in Russia. And of course got only worse post 2020. Les is talking about the United Nations. The thing to say about the United Nations is that the more powerful the United Nations is, the less independent it has to be. The more independent it becomes, the less powerful it is. And that's an impossible equation for it to jump out of. Vlad, are you a fan of? Hi, Rachel. Are you a fan of Tim Wilson, Professor Tim Wilson? No, I just noticed him sometimes on YouTube. I noticed he started talking about Russia more, and that he wears fantastic dressing gowns. So maybe I am a fan. Um, I'm just looking at the gerrymandering question about Gavin Newsom, but I lost it. Kevly26. Hello, Vlad. I'm wondering about what you think about Gavin Newsom's counter gerrymandering proposal. Well, might be worth talking about it at length another time, but this is going to be consistently what happens. You're going to face dilemmas. Do you want to do something you're uncomfortable to do because it might be institutionally undermining? If that's the best way to stand up to an anti-democratic counter-revolution in your country. And this is a difficult predicament. I mean, you're going to be choosing between these evils all the time. You're going to be forced into uncomfortable ways of resisting unlovely political enterprises that want to shake up and shake down your democratic system. So there aren't good answers there, but the case for doing what Newsom is doing is strong. Tomasz, how do we point to the authoritarian and anti-democratic tendencies of today's populists when their views are covered in doublespeak? You can't. The media can. I don't know. Nobody has done it. Maybe I should do it. But you need a manual for the New York Times, for the BBC, for mainstream institutions about how to deal with post-truth populist discourse, because they still can't do it. Look at the way Trump is being covered. Not only is stuff he says normalized by media that's actually opposed to him, but there's a kind of a normalization of incoherence in Trump's speech. Trump might say, well, we're here today, but we're not here, but we're very much not here, and it's great to be here today, even though we're not here at all. So you report that by saying Trump said contradictory things that don't make sense. That's what you do. But individual journalists can't do that unless they get institutional backing. So what do they report instead? Trump shares his perspective on being here. No, Trump didn't share his perspective on being here. Trump said a set of mutually exclusive, incoherent things. Report that. But don't report Trump made a comment on being here, and we've got a couple of experts in the studio who are going to decipher for us what he meant. That's very dangerous normalization. It happens because there is fear, and there is such a thing as institutional fear too, or at least institutional defensiveness. That we've got to fix. At the moment, institutions are passing the buck to their individual journalists, and the individual journalists are understandably passing the buck back to institutions. So we're in real trouble with that. But the way we're going is not going to be cool. It's not sustainable to do what we're doing and keep our democracy. So, as ever, my glasses, which I've lost, are on my head. Hello, Vlad. Hussein is asking, what causes conspiracy thinking? Can you give advice on both pulling someone we know out of that bubble and countering it on a large scale in politics? It's that you've got to understand that the main thing we're doing to counter conspiracy theories is wrong. We're trying to debunk them as though they were failures of an intellectual sort, as though we are trying to evoke in people who have fallen for them intellectual improvement. But people are not falling for conspiracy theories because they've got incandescently stupid. They're falling for conspiracy theories because they've lost trust. So the way you start is by understanding that trust is the problem underneath this information. At the moment, most commentary you consume on the resistance liberal side says that disinformation is the problem, and we just have to keep correcting it and emphasizing the facts. No, not at all. That's an elementary misunderstanding and a superficial misunderstanding of what's gone wrong. What's gone wrong is we've got a raging crisis of trust underneath the misinformation crisis. That's just the beginning of how we talk about this. Miss you nothing, Vlad. Always value your groundedness and sense of stability. I lack a sense of stillness, and illness makes this worse for me. I'm so sorry you're sick. Your calm and collectedness is admirable. Hug your way. Okay, now we're definitely caught up. Let's see. Invisible Paw is asking, are there any parallels for us from the 1840s revolutions? Well, there are, in the sense that what we're facing is obviously not the biggest political crisis since then. There have been many more political, many worse political crises that have happened between 1840 and today. But at the level of loss of trust in institutions, 1840 may well be a very good analogy. We may be facing the worst crisis of trust since the European revolutions of 1848. Imipac23 says, damn it, I thought of a great question the other day, but failed to write it down. The wonderful late philosopher Jerry Cohen, Oxford philosopher, used to make this joke about the eccentric Oxford academic who puts up their hand in a seminar and says, I'd like to make a point now, but I don't know what it is. It's not funny unless you unless you know the context and you actually know human beings who pretty much do that. Carter says, I've seen Vlad standing there, for he must be the real Slim Shady. Haven't stood since April, not even for a second. The aura light in the background. Should we be worried that Vlad's not wearing white today? Do you know what this is? This is a white shirt on which I spilled some food. And my partner dyed it for me. Okay. Johan, thank you for seeing me live and kicking. Clippy, the technician. Vlad, do you think Zionism and Nazism are two sides of the same fascist coin? No, I certainly don't. I mean, you can have a very benign, almost cultural conception of Zionism that says that the Jews needed a state of their own. Then you can have a richer, more political conception of Zionism, which says the Jews needed this particular state in that particular place. But I'm very skeptical about going down to that level to critique the current actions of Israel, or indeed many of the actions of Israel in recent years and decades. I think that a much better question to ask is, what does it mean to be adequate to the Holocaust? And what it means to be adequate to the Holocaust is to stay away from the kind of politics of intolerance and racism and demonization that engendered the Holocaust. And that's a very important question. It's a very important ethical question. Adequacy toward the Holocaust. And just what I've said right now is already very condemnatory of Israel's actions in Gaza. And here you also have to understand that never again doesn't mean never again to us. It means never again, period. But again, we're going to do a talk in detail about the situation in the Middle East soon. I'm feeling more and more people are asking for it. It's literally just the fact that a live does last an hour, hour and a half for me, but it's easier to do interactively from a health point of view than just speaking for an hour and a half spontaneously without interaction. But that's what it would take to, I think, just reground ourselves on Israel, Gaza. But I hope to do it very soon. Dominic is asking, is Hannah Arendt's thinking useful in the age of democratic decline? Yes, extremely useful. I'm not I'm an admirer of Arendt, but I'm not one of the greatest admirers of Arendt. I don't think she's a profoundly deep thinker. But her work is extremely important for us now. Matthias is asking, Vlad, Mr. Dugin, the Russian intellectual clown, so desperately wants to be relevant, but all I see is a poor man's version of Rasputin. Do average Russians laugh about or respect him? Average Russians have no idea who Dugin is. I mean, Dugin is no better known in Russia than in the West. Really, I mean, I don't know if it's is Dugin better known in Moscow than in London? Yeah, yeah, but like twofold, maybe. I mean, he's really that peripheral in Russia. The way Dugin operates is that he leverages his popularity in the West to legitimate himself in Russia. He's a Western-facing intellectual entertainer who is trying to become more relevant in Russia. The reason he is not anything like a Rasputin is that he doesn't have any relationship with Putin. He tries to engineer a potentially future relationship with Putin by figuring out where the Putin regime is going and trying to be there before it gets there. But that's his sort of entrepreneurial, as people online might say today, grift. Rob says, do you think Trump dying in office would immediately worsen the democratic decline in the US? It would be destabilizing for US democracy, but I wouldn't over dramatize this because I think that Trump is an example of an early onset authoritarian. You're going to face worse challenges in the 2030s. I mean, it sounds like a broken record here, but it's true. So I don't think an enormous amount would hinge on this in terms of where the United States would end up 20 years from now. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. Mr. Wastelander is saying, "Hey Vlad, let's talk about more interesting stuff. What do you think it would mean for humanity if 3I Atlas is in fact an alien spaceship en route to Earth? Um, End of the Ukraine war. At least I've been so sick. Is that an asteroid? I don't know what it is. If an alien spaceship were heading our way, um, in the full existential scenario sense of it, that there were aliens coming to planet Earth to run our lives, we would break into resistors and collaborators. And that would cross international boundaries to some extent, but not fully. It would still mostly be countries making the decision to collaborate or not collaborate. There is a lovely talk about this, where this scenario is beautifully philosophically centered by the late Bernard Williams, called The Human Prejudice. Google Bernard Williams and The Human Prejudice on YouTube, and you're going to see that talk delivered at the end of his life 25 years ago. Miguel Patricio is asking, is any democracy safe? No. No democracy is safe because all democracies are dependent on a fairly fragile social fabric to keep them going. So they're all completely capable of collapse. I don't mean societal collapse, I mean democratic collapse. What can we look for over the next 5 years? Asynchronicity is asking that it'll either show deep European unity or deep instability. There won't be deep European unity, there'd be more disunity. The key thing to look out for is how easily do European Trumps find it to sweep themselves into office over the next 5 years. Is what's happening in the UK now with the Reform Party coming top in the polls a reflection of what's going to happen in the next election or not? That's the key question. Alfred Cooper. Thank you, Mr. Wexler, for making time to inspire us with your thoughtful analysis to think more deeply about our world of realpolitik and these post-truth times. What books would you suggest we read for further insight on our present era? I think that you read one collection of essays about democratic regeneration. Let me just give you what they are. So here is one. Degenerations of Democracy. I also recommend reading the public intellectuals who I think say good things. Today that includes at least Michael Ignatieff, John Gray, Mark Lilla. On the psychological front, the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips. I would also throw in the philosopher Jonathan Lear. John Gray, the public intellectual in the UK. I mean, I've touched on about really 10-20%, but that's where we start. really. That's where we start. Um, I do hope that I'll come up with the kind of list that I recommend soon. That'll be more comprehensive. Maybe it'll be attached somewhere next to a video on my website. So look out for it. But I think that's about it. I mean, let me just give a second pass over and think about it again. So I also like a book from 20 years ago called The Cunning of Unreason by John Donne. I like a specific book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope, which is about how to deal with unfathomable cultural transformation or cultural devastation. For a recent critique of liberalism, I do like Samuel Moyn. And I admire him maybe even more as a speaker than a writer, but just Google up some interviews with Samuel Moyn. That's a sort of a smattering. We can do more, we can do better later. So Rachel asks me about Zack Polanski and his Green Party plans. I've not followed the Green Party as intensely. I know Adrian a bit, Adrian Ramsey, one of the co-leaders. He was the year below me at uni. Leave me to comment on that later, except for one aspect of it, and that's that, well, maybe two aspects of it. Well, maybe three aspects of it. Let's do three. I think Polanski's claim that we don't need NATO, which is ridiculous. I'm somebody who thinks NATO is extinguishing and expiring, but I don't suggest we jump off that platform. We try to build up something else and move from NATO to it over time. That's more ambitious than realistic, but that's how you've got to aspirationally think about it. So NATO is in decline. Article 5 is in tatters. That doesn't mean we step away from NATO, because if you're on a sinking boat and it's sinking slowly, it's not a good idea to just step into the ocean. So I reject that proposal. I think it's politically naive. Second, a generic remark. Where green parties are small in the West today, they should primarily focus not on what they would do if they were in power, because they're a million miles from being in power, but should think of themselves as micro workshops for what they might push bigger parties to do who do have the power they don't, right? So it's I don't want to hear from the UK Green Party too much the first 7 things they would do if they were the government. I want them to come up with ideas that the major parties could implement, they could pressure them to implement. And the third thing, I do think that the leadership of the Green Party needs to come from people who are actually in the House of Commons, in the main House of Parliament in the UK. That's important. Yeah, I mean, Rachel, I can't be sure because I've been so sick over the last few months exactly what Zack has been saying over these times. Um, Obviously, having headlines like UK must leave NATO because of Trump uh, are uh, catastrophic headlines for somebody who wants to be taken politically seriously. Tech Vec Sec saying, Vlad, how do you convince um, fellow libertarians here in Holland, party members, that more investment in defense is needed to deter Putin? By making the argument that Putin is a threat to Western Europe, but not exaggerating that argument. What you don't want to do is claim that, you know, as Mark Rutte recently did, that we're all going to be speaking Russian if this ends up badly for us. The Putin regime, even if we disarmed, really has no interest in Western Europe, but it's got a dispositional, uh, attitude of a proprietorial kind to all of Eastern Europe. So the starting point for conversation is, look, we are in trouble if a Russo-Chinese alliance is redrawing borders in Europe, etc., etc., etc. And then you talk about the fact that Putin's war in Ukraine isn't a territorial war; it's a war about A, regime security, and B, imperialist expansionism. Rachel, not a fan of your party. So this is the new party in the UK associated with Jeremy Corbyn. And I'll probably end up talking about it because it's a very natural phenomenon that this kind of peel off occurs um, amidst the failing technocratic centrism of the Labour Party. What I would say is that whatever you think of a party like that, you don't want Jeremy Corbyn as its leader because Jeremy has um, comically, cataclysmically appalling leadership skills. He's a very good organizer. I remember Jeremy from the anti-war movement prior to the Iraq War in 2002. Jeremy is not a leader of a party. He's certainly not a national leader. He does not have these skills. So whatever the chances of success for that party are, it's undermined by Jeremy being at the top. And Jeremy is not very reflective about that, I'm afraid. But again, this requires a bigger conversation. For the American perspective, I just want to emphasize that Jeremy is not the English Bernie Sanders. It's completely consistent to like Bernie Sanders, but not be impressed politically with Jeremy. And unless Jeremy's in the right job. If Jeremy is a major activist organizer of a movement, that's fantastic. That's Jeremy's milieu. That's his, domain of flourishment. But Jeremy has appalling leadership skills. I have appalling leadership skills myself. Jeremy's are far worse than mine. Right. Vlad and fellow humanity, are we focusing too much on political leaders when we need humanity to collaborate to avoid mass panic and fear from collapsing societies fermented by Machiavellian leaders? Let me try my best with your question. I think that the way to think about your question is to challenge the we in it a bit. Who is the we? It's certainly clear that we have a we here, right? We are a beautiful community. We're trying to gather a little bit online pretty regularly and bring it about that we feel more free and more insightful about and more efficacious, right, in respect to the political environment around us. But we're a little speck. So what's the we? When you begin to think about a we globally, you begin to think about a couple of hundred conflictive states, and enormous degrees of conflict and complexity within states too. So the question arises, what do we mean by we need to collaborate as humanity? Because the only way I can think of us collaborating is via interactions between the nation states. I don't see how we can get anything better going, anything that's an alternative going for now. I mean, you could have a case, make a case for a certain kind of spiritual revolution, for a certain kind of reenchantment, but you would be talking about the level of personal sentiment. There is no politics in that conversation. So, for real change, unfortunately, we're stuck with the institutions that we have, our ability to reform them, and then the human content that these institutions have. We can't do anything better. So there's a risk that we think in too aesthetic and moral a way about transformation, and that might lead us to take a position that could be very compelling expressively, but it's not actually going to be compelling effectively. If we think about a kind of liberal, pro-human rights, pro-social justice cosmopolitanism, there is going to be no politics in that cosmopolitanism. Because immediately, when we try to see what difference we can make in the world, we're going to have to address ourselves to actual power. And actual power means institutions, which we can alter, which have perceived legitimacy, and have a certain kind of human content. So I would make a distinction between transformation at the level of personal sentiment and actual political transformation. The question then might arise, what can we do about the human content of politics? And that's very, very difficult. Because, if I speak to colleagues of the older generation, folks who are in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they feel that certainly at the level of teaching in elite academic institutions, they feel that the enthusiasm to go into politics for clever students has largely evaporated. So we have a situation where the people we need to do politics are the people who are going to be most disinclined to do it. And that's very, very difficult. And we've got a situation where a much more entrepreneurial generation of politicians who are absorbed by self-advancement are succeeding in politics. And there are a lot of people in politics still who are not out for themselves, but they're suffocating. They're having a really, really tough time. So this is very difficult. And because we are in democratic crisis, you can't just stand up in a European country and say, well, let's redefine the benefits package and salary of a member of parliament, right? Um, Imagine if in the UK you tried to say, look, let's make the salary of a member of parliament, um, which must be about £60,000. I don't know what it is. Um, what is current salary of UK MP? Okay, I'm completely out of it. The basic annual salary for a UK MP is £93,000, April 2025. Um, if you made the case that, um, by the way, you still can't really live comfortably. Well, you can live comfortably on that in London, but you certainly can't buy property in London on that salary, um, um, unless it's a box and far out. So imagine you propose that the salaries of MPs were commensurate with the um, salaries of CEOs of national branches of major NGOs. So, you know, UNICEF, the country office for UNICEF, the CEO, what are they going to earn, and so on. So that would take us more toward maybe 200,000, £250,000 salary. If you tried to make a case for a salary like that in the UK, even though it would be normatively an impeccable case, it's commensurate with the level of responsibility you face. You're going to have to run before you can even utter the argument for a salary like that. I'm surprised it's that high. It's interesting. I'm so out of touch. UK MP salary. Ah, okay. It's less bad than I thought. You couldn't do it. So it's very, very difficult. How do you restore respect and dignity to that office? It's not easy. But you can, right? I mean, one of the effects of Mamdani running in New York has been that young people all over the country have thought to themselves, well, maybe I can go into politics. Maybe I can think about this. Somebody's talking about offensive realism and Mearsheimer. I'm going to do a main channel video on Mearsheimer one time when health allows, but it's in the plans. Yeah, I mean, even you guys will probably push back on me if I suggest that normatively I would have higher MP salaries. But I don't even think that's an argument. You can't make that case in a serious way politically. You're just going to be shot down straight away. So let's see if I missed something. Gerald says Tim Snyder thinks climate change could make states think in terms of zero-sum Darwinian competitions. Competition, do you think this is a possibility? Climate change will make our politics much uglier. And I hope to talk about this in more depth. I know so many people have asked for it, and I promise I will. It'll dramatically accentuate exclusionary politics and white identitarian politics in the West, I'm afraid. So we haven't yet seen eco-fascism properly. But unfortunately, we're going to see it in the next decade. Do you think there's a spiritual connection, Alexander is asking, between Stalin and Putin? No. Putin is not that big on Soviet history. I mean, he even thinks that the 1917 revolution was a kind of betrayal, actually. A betrayal organized by a foreign agent, Lenin. In some ways, Putin thinks of Lenin like he does of Navalny. So he's big on the Tsars, much bigger on the Tsars than he is on the Soviet period. Early Putin had more negative things to say about Stalin than he dared to say in public. What the later Putin thinks about Stalin, frankly, is less interesting. But he's not going to be one of the figures that he would idealize. So Stalin is not on the same level for Putin as Catherine the Great or Peter the Great or maybe even Alexander the Third. There's a video on the main channel comparing Putin with Alexander the Third, a very short video. For a few years, Alexander the Third was really Putin's main hero. Eric, why do so many centrist liberals struggle to recognize the genocide in Gaza? Somehow, plenty of nutcases are much clearer on it. So, put aside the G word first, right? What you're really asking is, why do centrist liberals sometimes fail to recognize that what is happening there is unfathomably appalling and unacceptable, far beyond any realm of oh, you've acted disproportionately, dear Israel, after the barbarism you suffered on October 7th. The fact that it's the fact that the murderousness of this state has reached ludicrous proportions, right? I think that there is an institutional factor. So if you're inside the Labour Party, it's not completely easy, especially if you're an up-and-coming young person, to say everything you want in public about this. The ethics of Gaza doesn't change the politics that major Western powers see Israel as a key ally in the region. But I suppose you're talking about sort of just a random liberal commentator who doesn't fully get it. I think that people are beginning to get it. I think that often the Russian opposition and Russian intelligentsia struggle to get it. Ukrainians also really struggle to get it. But they're taking a very pro-Israel position is just common. I think folks in the United States struggle to get it more than folks in Europe. But I think that enough people are becoming pretty conscious of what's going on. That is now becoming a part of, if you like, centrist liberal consciousness, whatever that is. But if you want to sort of think about how to be objective here, you've got to start with an emphasis on numbers. Numbers really matter. Intent matters, but numbers matter. Number of civilians you've killed. That's very important. You cannot have a conversation that abstracts that away. Overall, I just invite you into my long form chat whenever I'm going to do it about this. CR Matheny is asking, a politics of civic duty a la Peace Corps, human rights based, benevolently militant, perhaps a pipe dream in the near term. Strength needn't be cruel, kindness needn't be weak. Is this a fascist thought? I'm not sure exactly what you mean, um, but certainly the Peace Corps culture doesn't isn't the fascist culture as far as I can tell. I mean, I've interacted with the Peace Corps folks and know a little bit about the organization from my time in the Pacific. A lot of Peace Corps folks in Tonga when I was living there. Um, and then abstractly, the thought that strength is a good thing and doesn't need to be cruel, and that kindness need to be weak. These are not fascist thoughts. Which Russian propaganda narratives are most harmful for Ukraine and the West? I think that's the wrong question, because the point about Russian propaganda is that it's mostly harmful by saturating the informational environment with ill-assorted messages that push and pull people in different directions and then confuse them and make them passive. Thank you, Norman. Malako says, why aren't you drawn to anarchism or social ecology, the political ideology that is getting tested in a few parts of the world? Um, One of my very early teachers 25 years ago, who's an expert on Polish politics and East European politics, Anthony Kemp Welch, thinks of himself as an anarchist. Um, Anarchism is for me not bad politics. It's not even a political position. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in the writings of Proudhon or Bakunin. I am. They're very interesting writings. But in the end, anarchism is not a good or bad political position. It's not a political position at all. Perhaps I'll talk about that more on the philosophy channel. Um, and then the other part of the question was about eco something. So sorry to have lost your question. Let me see if I can find it again. I can't find it again. My position on various kinds of eco ideas is complex. I mean, I have, I've read quite a bit of Heideggerian ecology. Um, in the end, on climate, my view is that we've got to push whatever we do through the institutions that we have. And our institutions, flawed as they are, in an amended form, are our best bet of getting anywhere with climate. I am a climate alarmist. I do think it's the single biggest issue we face in the 21st century because it's the issue of all issues. It's going to trigger human movement. It's going to trigger wars. It's going to trigger democratic collapses. It's going to trigger state collapses, not in the West, in some parts of the world. So it's the issue of all issues. It's the number one issue of the 21st century for me. I think we're not doing um, anything like enough about it, but doing more is incredibly hard because there's a very painful conflict now between, quite frankly, proposing anything like a Green New Deal and legitimacy. Most Western populations will just not think of you as legitimate if you propose a Green New Deal. Let's run 15 more minutes, beautiful community. Sam 3, is Putin neurodiverse? This is very important as a question, not about Putin, but generally, because we have to start placing people properly. What particularly you're looking for in politics are not neurodiverse people who are highly competent and self-aware, like Angela Merkel, but neurodiverse people who have no idea about their neurodiversity and are not self-aware, like Liz Truss, for example. Do I feel Russian to a certain degree? Yes, of course, but it's quite minimal. I mean, think about it. I left at 9, so I feel very alien in Russian culture. It's very weird. I'm treated like an alien because I sort of say the words and I understand the culture internally, but I sound like I'm an alien. I sound very, very culturally removed. So I feel quite unfree in Russian. Um, but of course, there is a way in which it structures my personality. But it's quite pale, quite frankly. I mean, I'm basically very, very West European. I make the joke that sometimes, um, in fact, it's not true. It almost never happens. But like once in a blue moon, a Ukrainian might suggest that I take a certain view of something because of my Russian background. For instance, my view that Russia is not uh, likely to disintegrate in the near future, mm, or that the Putin regime is relatively stable. Um, and the irony is that, well, yeah, Ukraine is very different to Russia at level of political culture, but outside politics, the psychological cultural proximity between Ukraine and Russia is huge, obviously. So the self-defeating thing is that the Ukrainian criticizing me is 10 times closer to Russians than I am. So that's the paradox. I think that um, Isaiah Berlin, my hero, who left Russia, um, Riga and Petersburg, so Latvia first, um, at the age of about 12, was he 12? Um, is way more Russian than me. Way more Russian than me. Even though he's mainly not Russian, but he's way more Russian than me. So I mean, you're basically looking at the West European um, with a predilection for bits of the UK, but also for Central Europe too. That's where I feel most at home. And a lot of my warmth and tactility and directness are more South European than Russian, actually, probably. So, um, but I of course don't deny that there's something that inflects it there. Um, I think when I was much younger, I used to be more dismissive of that Russian element, and I'm less dismissive of it now, but it's minor. Emmy Love says Liz Truss has 0 levels of emotional intelligence. Well, for goodness sake, this is somebody who needs a neurodiversity diagnosis, who never had it, who was mistreated all her childhood because she never got her diagnosis and so on. That doesn't excuse how she crashed the economy and so on, but it's important for us to start having these conversations for real. Um, Sam 3 says a massive gap in Vlad's thinking hasn't counted. Um, that he doesn't understand developmental trauma. That's a whole field he lives out and simply blames ADHD on autistic people. So you're flat wrong, because every single time I have said something about somebody's autism or ADHD, I've been correct. So I'm not sure if I've said that 7 times or 11 times, but if it's 11, it's 11 to me, 0 to you, because you'd be wrong every single time you challenge that. Because I'm very conservative how you abuse these labels. So I wouldn't say it if it weren't true. There's plenty of developmental trauma with Trump, for example, but that doesn't rule out the neurodiversity as a driving force too. Sorry to be tough, but I'm just at the stage where I'm not going to take any bullshit about neurodiversity, because a it's important for us to understand it, because some of the most special humans are neurodiverse. But b, when somebody's mishandling their neurodiversity uh, and are in possession of great power, um, I'm going to stop being gentle about the idea. I've got to talk about it, because I've received endless letters over the last year or two saying, Vlad, I'd really rather prefer if you didn't talk about Trump's neurodiversity or Merkel's neurodiversity or whoever else's neurodiversity. I think it should be a private matter. And I think that what I've very clearly decided in the last year or two is that when it comes to very significant amounts of power that are in somebody's hand, I have zero patience for the suggestions we shouldn't talk about it. So that's the slightly contrived forcefulness that I'm pushing here. That's what it's all about. I'm trying to encourage the idea that it's not even a debate whether we should or shouldn't do it, um, because uh, the case you can make for people's privacy is not worth it. And then the other, it's not a strong enough case relative to the fact that what they do impacts our lives. There's no way you can persuade me to not talk about Elon Musk's neurodiversity, right? It's just not plausible. Um, Plus, it's very useful because so many people are neurodiverse and don't know it. And we still have so many prejudices about neurodiversity. That's why it's so important, I think. Uh, you know, and Malfitano saying that neurodiversity refers to conditions like autism and ADHD, which is not mental disorders. I mean, just elementary things like recognizing that ADHD and autism are not psychological problems. So it's just elementary things we don't stably understand as societies. Um, so developmental trauma, Slimsky is asking, does that cause neurodivergence? No. As far as I'm concerned, uh, you are born neurodiverse, but your neurodiversity can be exacerbated by interventions, like viral interventions, for example, which is why we've had an exaggeration of neurodiversity post 2020. Pharmaceutical interventions can do that too, um, but they can't cause it. They can't cause it. Um, is what I've just said entirely true? No, but that's the base assumption with which we start before we end up in a more sophisticated conversation. Clippy the technician, Vlad, do you think Putin is today's great man of history? It's an idea that's becoming increasingly popular in geopolitics circles. The problem with Putin is that he genuinely has relatively unchecked power on the foreign stage. His hands are more tied when it comes to domestic policy, and he's much more like engaged in sort of triangulation and balancing of conflicts between various clans. On the foreign policy, he has unlimited power the way democratic leaders don't. And that's why, quite frankly, it's hard to avoid the idea that you have to talk about his psychology, you have to talk about what he wants. Because this is a guy who is not going to be challenged easily when it comes to foreign policy by people around him. I don't diagnose anybody, Sam3 is asking. I am not diagnosing anybody. It's not my job to do that. All I'm saying is that it's an appropriate part of political analysis to reflect on the neurodiversity of political actors wielding enormous power where relevant. That's what I'm saying. Nobody's diagnosing anybody. So the latest thing you're saying there, right, that Trump's not ADHD, shows you don't have the faintest understanding of neurodiversity. So figure it out, then start lecturing people after. If somebody's going to get a book by Isaiah Berlin, what should we get first? Brian is asking. Just get a collection of essays. Get probably The Proper Study of Mankind as a collection of essays. Or just Google Isaiah, search for Isaiah on YouTube and see what lectures are up there, listen to those. But The Proper Study of Mankind is the thickest collection. I suppose if you wanted to know about anti-authoritarian intellectual currents in 19th century Russia, you could read Russian Thinkers, which is also a nice collection. But otherwise, I'd recommend The Proper Study of Mankind. Sorry, Sam3, for the fact that I've been so mean to you, but I've just been so mean to you because of the unjustified confidence with which you've come in. Yuso is saying, I'm diagnosing you as an INFJ on Myers-Briggs. No, I am E, because I am on the border between an extrovert and an introvert. I'm happy to not speak to anybody for a very long time. So I have all of the traits of introverts, but I don't have the stress that introverts have around socializing. Obviously, I'm too ill to socialize at the moment much, but and I can't go anywhere because I can't walk. But being around humans does not drain me at all. And talking to you now from an emotional point of view does not drain me at all. So it's hard to call me an introvert, even though I would be shockingly stable if you said, Vlad, we're going to take care of your medical needs in every way, but you're going to be alone for 2 years without a single word exchange with another human being. I'd be shockingly stable through that. You might think, well, that definitely means he's an introvert. No, because all the stresses that introverts feel, I don't feel. I don't need to recover from social interaction. If anything, social interaction gives me energy, or at least is neutral. So I'm a marginal E, then I'm clearly an N on the Myers-Briggs by a very long way, like something like, I think it's 88 to 12 last time I took the test a few years ago. And that's because as a philosopher, my more special qualities are all about just looking and imagination, more than rigorous systematic reflection. I'm very analytical relative to an average person on the street, but I'm not very analytical as a philosopher. In other words, my gifts at the level of analytical systematicity are decent, but they're secondary to my gifts around various kinds of insight imagination. So it's N, and then as much as I have a lot of T, I have more F than T, and you can feel that. That's why you relate to me. And then in the end, I have a lot of J, but I'm a P. As a philosopher, I just have to be a P. Kant is saying E ENTP. It's ENFP overall, but I'm not massively F relative to T because obviously I do a lot of thinking as a philosopher. So it's about 60-40 in favor of feeling over thought. And on N over S, intuition versus sensing is like 90-10. And P is probably something like 60 over 40, 65 over 35. So on the Myers-Briggs, for those who are interested in it, which I think is a super useful category, but it's not psychologically explanatory, just good for mapping people at work into boxes, I am ENFP. CPU is asking, are you optimistic about the future? I'm hopeful about the future, and I feel a lot of optimism about the future, but my standards are all about the past in general and not the recent past. If we compare the future with the recent past, it'll be worse. Yvonne says, feel you. I love being alone, but I'm not misanthropic. I've always thought solitary confinement wouldn't be the punishment they think it is. I'm also very big, as you might guess, on anti-misanthropy. I love human beings as they are. Which obviously doesn't mean that I love when they engage in calamitous acts, but I love human beings as they are. I don't feel the need to make the world as it is become the world as it should be. That would be something human hating about that for me. I don't want all philosophers to be good. I don't want all YouTube content to be good. I don't want all musicians to be great. That wouldn't be human. But I do want the worst bits of human suffering minimized, of course. Of course, I do want that. Okay, let's take a couple more and then round ourselves off. Can you recommend a film to watch? Austin is asking. Um, uh, since the war, the films that I would mostly recommend would probably be the films of Louis Buñuel, especially The Phantom of Liberty, and the films of Ingmar Bergman, especially Cries and Whispers. I am also an admirer of Tarkovsky, but Tarkovsky's expression is for me a little more suspicious than the expression of Bergman or Buñuel. But these are just three filmmakers among others who I have a deep relationship with and warmly recommend. There are many other great films, but these are filmmakers who themselves made a good number of great films. And that's why I pick them out. There's a lot of people who just made one good film or two good films. Seriously Silly is saying, I love Tarkovsky's Mirror. A lot of people really struggle to grasp Mirror. Neil is asking, is Tarkovsky part of great Russian culture? I suppose the answer is yes, but Tarkovsky is also very French in many ways. There's a kind of a French postmodernism. Liz is asking, how long did I live in Tonga? Not long, less than a couple of years. In something like 05 and 06. When I had just stabilized into an ill but stable state, having got ME. Carter is asking, what do I think of Schwankmayer's Alice in Wonderland? I like it less than the early films that Alfred Brendel really, really admires, which have a kind of penetrating metronomic perfection to them. The longer form mixed media stuff he's done is less compelling. A friend took me to see Schwankmayer's Alice in Wonderland cinema, but I don't have the same this must be part of my life relationship with it that I have with the early short masterpieces. So I'm not an admirer of his later work. And just to be self-indulgent, I'll be completely self-indulgent here. There we go. This is a piece by me on Schwankmayer's early films. If anybody is interested. Gregory says, sorry if I misrepresented your view. There's no problem at all with that. Lebowski says, do you read lighter Russian prose? No, I don't. Or do you read fiction from Dmitry Gluchovsky? No, I don't. But I do think Dmitry Gluchovsky is one of the very best commentators on Russia for Russians. Carter, don't read it again. I'm just sharing it with any film buffs who are here. But I just think there's a huge gap in quality between these films that I mentioned there and the later work by Schwankmeyer. Okay, so shall we call it a day? Beautiful community. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for forgiving me for being so unbelievably mean too. I forgot who it was. I'm so sorry. Is it Sam? Yeah, Sam 3. So sorry for being so mean to Sam 3 about neurodiversity when Sam said that I over apply it instead of focusing on developmental trauma. Thank you. Lots of love. Talk soon. Yeah, well, Emmy says I'm a meanie. Yeah, you have to. This is why you gotta have some regular conversations here. Because if I don't talk to you enough, there's nobody to moderate my behavior, and I get mean and just get completely out of control. So you got to do your job, beautiful community, and keep me in check. Good night, everybody. Good night, Ferrari guy. Good day, Rachel. Goodbye, TK McClone. Thank you so much, Amalfitano. Bye, lovely Carter. Bye, Anthony. Ciao, 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 everybody. Mark, thank you. Jan, good night. Ben, good night. Good night, good night, good night. Goodbye. There we go.